You are in the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum on the South Campus of FIU, in case you didn't know where you were. I know some of you from out of town, so I'm glad you made it out here today. It's quite a full day. Congratulations, Rebecca, on this incredible agenda, and we're in Act 3. I'm Jordana Pomeroy. I'm the director of this fine museum, and I also understand that quite a few of you have not seen the exhibition yet. So it's been a high point among all the exhibitions we've offered here at the Frost. This museum's been open since 2008, although there's been a museum on campus for 40 years. As you can see, the museum itself is a commitment to aesthetics, values, and free cultural expression. There is a life after Bob Dylan, and so feel free to sign up to receive our newsletter. You can give your email at the front desk. As part of our mission, we like to work across the curriculum to cross-pollinate and make all our programs stronger. And this exhibition of Dylan's visual practice is just one facet of how Dylan has been an FIU focus for 5 months. The Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab has investigated Dylan's legacy as well as his imprint on the future. Rebecca Friedman is founding director of the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab and associate professor of history at FIU. Much of her work at FIU involves public humanities and community engagement, especially highlighting the cultural and intellectual spirit of the greater Miami region. She is going to be your MC for the day. Will you please welcome Dr. Friedman?
It's not fair because I've stacked the deck. I have all my students here. Hey. Welcome, everyone, from me. Rebecca Friedman, the director of the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab. Welcome from FIU at large to today's Act 3, conversations about Dylan as artist, thinker, poet, performer, which is the third, as Dr. Pomeroy said, the third of 3 acts as part of the program called Beyond Generations, Dylan Through the Looking Glass. This, of course, is our final act. We have looked at Dylan from the upper room at the Ward Rooming House with Rich Medina and Christopher Norwood last weekend. Last night, we looked at Dylan from the rear view, Folkways and Dylan's Origins at the Center for Subtropical Affairs, where we heard, among others, Sarah Lee Guthrie, the granddaughter of the great Woody Guthrie, as well as Still Blue. Shout out to Enrique Rosell, who's here in the audience. Great show last night. And today, as I said, it is our final act. So we've invited 4 world-renowned experts on Bob to talk about their expertise, their experiences, share their knowledge with us and with one another today. And I'm really excited about this conversation. And in a way, this is our protracted way of bidding farewell to this beautiful, complex exhibition, Retrospectrum, curated by Shai Baitel, the artistic director of the Museum of Modern Art in Shanghai, who will be with us later today. So I'm obligated as director to say lots of thank yous. So you have to bear with me to say all my thank yous, and then we'll move on to the program. First of all, I want to thank Shai for bringing this exhibition to the Frost Museum. I want to thank Dean Brian Schreiner, who basically had faith in us at the very end and allowed this program to move forward. To Heaven's Door, Bob Dylan's award-winning whiskey, to the Tonkinson Foundation, to Lark Bennett, to Richard Thomas, Enrique Rosell, and to the other experts I'm about to introduce you to today. So quickly, let me go over the schedule. We're going to have our panel now until about 1 o'clock. Then we're going to retreat to the room next door and have some lunch, and also hear some tunes from Bradley Loretti, who some of us heard last night. He's going to sing a little bit for us today. And we're also going to have the typewriter challenge, which was an invention of Enrique. I have to give him credit for that. He's brought in his personal 4 typewriters, and we have collected people's favorite Dylan lyrics, and we've put them at the top of the page, and they are in the typewriters, and so you're to finish that poem for us over lunch, and we'll read them at the end of the day after Shai says his words. Okay, so without any further ado, I am going to introduce our first speaker, Professor Richard Thomas. Did I get that right? You're first, right? Richard Thomas, please come up. He is the George Martin Lane. It's a long introduction, so you got to wait a second. I apologize. You know, these people are accomplished. Richard Thomas is the George Martin Lane Professor of Classics at Harvard University. Born in London and brought up in Auckland, New Zealand, he did his PhD at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, my alma mater as a PS. Since 1977, go blue, since 1977, he's taught on ancient Greek and Roman literature, on the reception of classical literature over the last 2 millennia, including in the works of Dante, Milton, and Bob Dylan, on whom he has taught a freshman seminar every 4 years since 2004. He's written several books and more than 100 articles on classical subjects, and he is the author of the incredibly well-written and beautiful book, Why Dylan Matters, that came out in 2017. He has been with us since the beginning, and I cannot thank him enough. Richard.
Thank you, Rebecca, for those very kind words. And yes, it's a bittersweet occasion. We started over a year ago, having our Thursday meetings, and but it's great to be involved with the culmination and also with other Dylan friends and scholars who are joining us today. So I think we have just about 80 minutes as I make it. So I think I'm going to talk for no more than 15, so there are at least 5 minutes for discussion, and that way that will give time to the other speakers. So Dylan, a classic. And so here you have a classicist who works on Greek and Latin poetry, that is dead language texts that are still around, but I'm not claiming in any way that Dylan is a classic other than as a songwriter and singer and performer of those songs. So I'm not claiming that Dylan can be read on the page in the same way that Homer, Virgil, and others can be read on the page, but I am claiming that his song is in that tradition, and that makes what his classic an utterly new one, because it's sung classical literature. But of course, going back to Sappho was sung, we don't know the music. So he's in that sung tradition, that is a lost tradition that he's brought back to life. So yeah, definitions of the classic. I think Samuel Johnson said a work which everybody knows but nobody has read. Another is a work which people praise and don't read. And then Mark Twain, you can read for yourself, since that's been up for a bit. I'm not going to do that for you. A slightly more serious person who took himself slightly more seriously, maybe too seriously, T.S. Eliot. What is a classic? In 1947, wrote an article, no definition of a classic can exclude Virgil's Aeneid, so he wrote one that basically defined it. It's a hugely problematic essay written not because of Eliot's anti-Semitism, which is another story and which is there, but because it basically is a really weird post-World War II reading of Virgil. But I think it's correct in saying that the maturity of a language, a literary language, the maturity of a society, and you can read English or American, and you can read Washington, D.C. or America for maturity of society, whatever that means, thinking from the 60s through to now. And then, of course, the ingredient of a genius, the inexplicable genius, in this case, coming from northern Minnesota, but becoming the classic in the English language, the sung English language of the last 60 years. So this is a review, one of the early reviews of my aforementioned book, which basically found it an unconvincing book, but among other things said, this is Sean O'Hagan in The Guardian, the same year of The Guardian said that my book was the Guardian Book of the Year, Music Book of the Year, so Sean didn't get that message. But anyway, so you can read, one can only wonder what the singer's poetic predecessors would have made of lines as throwaway as the opening verse. Oh, the streets of Rome are filled with rubble, ancient footprints are everywhere. So yeah, you read it, and it's maybe not that impressive, right? So soon after that review, Dylan started performing the songs again. He hadn't performed them no, I won't say why he started performing them, but he did. And I'm not going to say too much about the song because one of our speakers is going to be addressing it in very interesting and vital ways. But it's interesting that I'm trying to read through this palm tree, which is sort of that I think the song has something to do with the classical world, something that's out of reach, someplace you'd like to be beyond your experience, and so on. So this was about this song in an interview, which was about Rough and Rowdy Ways. So it's a very marked part of that interview. So that was never a minor song, even though it wasn't put on the album of its day. Maybe that's part of its being a great song. It was left to be discovered. So just a couple of definitions that I found very helpful by Italo Calvino, the journalist and writer, Italian writer, writing in the 40s, 50s, and so on. So I won't go through all of them, but you can note some of them. So for books, just read songs or works. And I think you can see that Dylan really fits this in ways that few others, nobody, I think, no singer, in my view, maybe even Leonard Cohen fits quite in a way that Dylan fits. And particularly number 10, perhaps, a classic, is a book which comes to represent the whole universe. And then for my remaining time, I'd like to explore the distillation of that by the editor of the 1991 translation of Why Read the Classics. A classic is a work which retains a consciousness of its own modernity without ceasing to be aware of other classic works of the past. And I think that really captures Dylan, not just a Dylan since 2001, since he started channeling particular high register classical Greek and Latin literary texts, but which I think fits generally. And so that modernity, the modernity of meeting Botticelli's niece, or a pretty little girl from Greece, how does that modernity work for that song? And we might play the same verse and look at the lyric that has changed and listen to the voice and think about Dylan, who writes a song that fits a 71, a 28-year-old or the 21-year-old that he's thinking about, but also then suits an 80-year-old. Okay, that clip didn't work. Maybe the Dylan people already took it out because it's it's from Shadow Kingdom, but I'll try and sing it. Oh, no, I won't. The streets of Rome are filled with rubble. Ancient footprints are everywhere. You can almost think that you see in double on a cold, dark night by the Spanish stairs. And you'll see the verse so far is unchanged, as it is through many of them, although the second verse, the wonderful change in the third line, or those mighty kings of the jungle, I could hardly stand to see them. I could see them coming. I could read their faces like a book, which in performance is wonderful. But the second part of the first verse, got to hurry on back to my hotel room, going to wash my clothes, scrape off all of the grease, going to lock my doors and turn my back on the world for a while, going to stay right there, should be, and until I paint my masterpiece. And it's sung in that 80-year-old voice. You know, where did his shirt get so greasy that he's got to scrape it off? What does that hotel room look like that he's now in? And that is part, I think, of that particular definition of a classic, retaining its consciousness of modernity without ceasing to be aware of other classic works by the same author of the past. Still not working, but that's good. We're all familiar with the Nobel lecture from June 2007, which along with the 2015 Music Cares speech is the most revealing and true and honest about Dylan's art. I'm not going to go through it all, but of course the triad of books he ends with, Moby Dick, All Quiet on the Western Front, and the Odyssey, which I knew that the lecture was coming up because to get his $900,000, he had to get it in within 6 months. So my publisher gave me an extra 2 weeks, which got just to the deadline. And I was able to confirm that what I'd written about the Odyssey in Dylan was in fact true. But I've said that so many times, I should stop saying it. But just as end, I won't. The previous, our songs are alive and in the land of the living, but songs are unlike literature. They're meant to be sung, not read. The words in Shakespeare's plays were meant to be acted on stage, just as lyrics in songs are meant to be sung, not read on a page. And I hope some of you get the chance to listen to these lyrics the way they were intended to be heard in concert or on record, or however people are listening to songs these days. I return once again to Homer, who says, "Sing in me, O Muse, and through me tell the story." So that's in 217. And of course, in 2020, he delivered on that promise and gave us Rough and Rowdy Ways, the album that came out of COVID, and which I can only touch on here, but you can just see from some of the titles. Mother of Muses is the one that particularly picks up on that end of that Nobel speech, Crossing the Rubicon, which he's now started playing and performance, yay. But also bits of the Aeneid in my own version of you, unmistakable bits of the Aeneid, wait over by the cypress tree where the Trojan women and children are being sold into slavery. There's only one text or place that can come from, that's Virgil's Aeneid. So anyway, just a word about my own slight changing of the Italo definitions. A classic is a work that puts itself into a tradition and is informed by its place in that tradition through intertextuality and transfiguration, is the way that I would put it. And that use of transfiguration, of course, is Dylan's own application of that to influence what used to be called influence, what can be called allusion or reference, but what intertextuality is a convenient generic term. So just in brief, and obviously absurdly in brief, that Virgil channels Homer. So as you read Virgil, you hear the Homeric voice, and that informs your reading of Virgil. So the target text out to the left, who is enriched and made denser by those intertexts, the presence of the Bible and Virgil. Basically, without Book 6 of the Aeneid, Dante couldn't have written the Inferno. It doesn't mean that it's an equal to it, but that it's part of the stream, part of the tradition. It gets complicated the more you have behind you. And of course, Bob Dylan has more behind him than anybody else in human history. So the complexity of Dylan and that, etc. After Whitman could go on for another few lines. But that's essentially just a scheme of how I would be thinking about Dylan, the classic in song. This is Crossing the Rubicon, which I'm not going to play because I'm going to bring things to a close. But again, along the lines of the two versions of When I Paint My Masterpiece. So here's just a verse. Well, no, I'm not going to play this verse because I want to end. But Dylan knows what he's talking about here. Lucan, the poet, the post-Virgilian and post-Ovidian epic of Rome, about the civil war of Rome. Basically, when Dylan sings the Rubicon is a red river, that brings in the red rivers of America, whether northern Minnesota or Texas, and all of the Red River traditions that are incredibly rich within the American context. But it's also the Latin word rubeo, means to be read, and I think Dylan is picking up on that because he's picking up on the play that Lucan has already instilled there. So a trigger warning, we're about to look at something, read something, and maybe hear something that somebody on the web, Dylan, one of the many Dylan people out there who follow Dylan's every word, found. And it's basically an embedding by Dylan in this verse, into a performed version of this verse, of an obscene epigram from the Greek anthology, which is an incredibly rich tradition of epigrams from 2 lines to 12 lines generally, but more like 2, 4, 6, 8 lines. And this is a very obscene one that's coming up, so avert your gaze and block your ears if necessary. It's been deleted, yeah. So you foxy man, you're the talk of the town, sucking off the younger men. I trusted you once, that was more than enough. I'll never trust another living soul again. Or I'll cut you, and then back to the, but I'll cut your heart out with a broken, not a crooked knife, and I'll weep over you when you're gone. Oh Lord, I stood between heaven and earth, and I crossed the Rubicon. Yeah, I'm not sure why. It may have been changing from Keynote to PowerPoint, but anyway, you can find it. It's out there on the Ethernet, Ether world, whatever. So and there's that first century BC or AD epigrammatist from whom Dylan's obviously borrowed. Why? Because you're the talk of the town, and then the activity of the foxy man pick up on two separate and undeniable details in the epigram, and that's part of Dylan's intertextuality. He makes it that you can't say, oh no, that's just an accident, talk of the town, it's a common phrase. Oh yeah, but then show me another place where it's along with line one of that epigram, which I won't read out for you. But that's from Since Love and Theft. That's been Dylan's MO, whether it's a Confessions of a Yakuza or Ovid or Twain or whoever, that he gives more than one. So his defenders can't say, oh no, Bob's not plagiarizing, it's just an accident. He wants you to know, like creative plagiarism, you're supposed to notice, and you're supposed to then make the next step of saying what it does to you and to your listening of that song. So anyway, I don't think this has been noticed, but I noticed that in mid-March, what replaced that talk of the town was something else. A bit when I heard it in Austin, it was the first real performance in it, and you couldn't quite hear the right or wrong. But right or wrong, what can I say? What more needs to be said? I'll spill your brains out upon the ground. You'd be better off over there with the dead. The sinister, violent voice that's characterized recent Dylan albums and as a literary voice, in particularly rough and rowdy ways, is also the voice of Odysseus and Polyphemus. Polyphemus who eats Odysseus's men, Odysseus who blinds and taunts the blinded Polyphemus. And that voice Dylan has found for himself. So Helen in Book 4 of the Odyssey, who's made it back to her husband Menelaus, but says, right or wrong, what can I say? In the same translation, Fagles, and then the Cyclops, I'd smash him against the ground, I'd spill his brains. So again, those two separate Odyssey references. No, not sure what happened there. So yeah, just to end up, these definitions, which I think are useful to think about if you want to take a photo of that screen as you think about Dylan, the classic. And I'll leave it up there. And as I think we go into, 5 minutes till noon. Okay, so we'll everyone perform and then, no, that makes sense. Yeah, so we each do that.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that great talk. This is the point in the program where I think I am obliged to mention, I'm very new to the Dylan. I'm kind of looking in from the outside for this past year, but I understand it's a fairly male-dominated scholarly community. Is that fair to say? So it was noted that we today have 3 women and 1 man. So this is an unusual moment. So every speaker who comes up from now on is going to be a woman identified person. Okay, now we have Rebecca Slaman, who is Rebecca Slaman, who is a writer and social media aficionado. She is relatively new to the Bob Dylan fandom, but is a strong presence in the online Dylan community. During the pandemic, she studied and wrote about Gen Z's relationship to him, and can't wait to hear what you all think of her findings. Without any further ado, the other Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. I love to see so many diverse faces here, a lot of old, young, anywhere in between. And thank you to everyone tuning in at home. I know a lot of people from my online communities are there. So hello, everyone. So my name is Rebecca Slaman. And my question is, why does Bob Dylan appeal to youth? It's the same question that reporters have been asking of him since 1965, and you may be asking it now. You might not even know that there's a huge young people community online who love Bob Dylan. And the other question I have is, why am I here? It's a question you might be asking if you don't know me, and I am also wondering this. I'm a young queer woman, and I'm not the core demographic you might think of as a Bob Dylan fan. However, I know the demographic you're thinking of, and I think they have less to say about Bob Dylan than I do. I consider myself an anthropologist, and the environment that I study is the internet. I'm 24 years old. I'm right on the cusp of Gen Z and millennial. And as I've grown up, social media has become more populated with people of all different kinds, but as its core is fandom. And Bob Dylan fandom is so old. How old is it? It is an academic study. But what does it mean to study a single person's work? What I like to study is those people. And what I'm interested in talking to you about today and exploring more in our conversation later is how this happened. Why do people like Bob Dylan, and why am I here? If you're a fan of Dylan, I ask you to ask yourself what age you were when you got into him. If you're younger than 80, Bob's contemporary, it's probably pretty young. I polled my followers, and they all said the same thing. All demographics said teenage to early 20s. Bob Dylan has been an influential figure in pop culture since he was young, and his ubiquity and enormous catalog allows an ease of discovery to his music. Whether it's on a streaming service now, or through your older siblings or parents' records, he's pretty easy to find. But why does he appeal to youth? There is, of course, times they are a-changing, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that because it's the most obvious example. But that sort of protest singer image is something that can be a gateway into Bob Dylan. Mothers and fathers throughout the land can't criticize what you don't understand. That is youth. And that is what originally got me into Bob Dylan. And right now we're living in a time where there is this progressive activism versus these fascist leaders in our world. And looking to history can help us sort of make sense of what's going on and how we can move forward through that. And it's certainly a factor in Bob Dylan's longevity. It's an accessible window into the past. There's also the artistic confidence of the going electric myth. He went against everything everyone expected of him, and it kind of embodies teenage rebellion at its finest. And it's very rock and roll, it's very entertaining. And for every subsequent era, that stays constant for the image of youth, is this idea of rebellion. But one thing people don't give teenagers and young people enough credit for is their humor. He was and is extremely funny. Maybe in a way only understandable by today's humor standards. While there are many think pieces about the qualities of Gen Z and millennials, like what we're doing to the economy, how we're all obsessed with our cell phones, I think the one that we choose to define ourselves through, especially online, is through humor. It's this very abstract, silly, nonsensical humor that creates all these inside jokes. I mean, we invented memes. And Bob definitely applies to that kind of humor. When he would carry around a giant light bulb to interviews, when he lied to his girlfriend's mom and said he had a degenerative eye disease to get out of the relationship. When he showed up on Pawn Stars in one of the only television appearances of the last 20 years and gave an autograph to Chumley. When he starred in a film in the 80s that was a vehicle for himself and completely failed to show up for it. It is the funniest movie I've ever seen. You might say it's intentional, I do, but either way, it's hilarious. When he Even things that are unintentionally funny are perfectly so to our sort of third-person perspective. When he showed Phil Oakes a new song that he wrote in a limo, and Phil Oakes said it sucked, so he kicked him out of the car. When he revealed about 10 years into his career that he could actually sing well by like contemporary standards, like, why would you wait that long to reveal that? When he was being filmed for Don't Look Back, he was backstage and about to go on stage, and he asked, "Why are the lights out?" Someone said, "Bob, you're supposed to go on. What are you doing, man?" And all these things about generations, I think that what defines them, you could say generations are invented to sell us things, but it's mostly defined by what is happening when we are young. And Bob Dylan didn't stay young forever, and that isn't what we've come to know. We know Dylan by what he was to us when we first discovered him, usually when we're young. And if you're a contemporary of Bob, you could say he's like a needless troublemaker. If you're slightly younger, say a boomer, you probably saw him at the height of rock and roll in the Rolling Thunder Revue. He's back out of the woods. He's performing with vigor unseen before. Or Gen X, you might have a more complicated first introduction to him. He was a rocker turned evangelical, a burnt out old guy maybe. Or as I know some people, through the Wilburys, a lighthearted dad rock icon that might have been introduced to you by your dad. And from here on out, you could say he's just coasting on that nostalgia from the previous generations. Except Gen Z is different. Unless you grow up in a very music-literate household, you might have no tether to him at all. He might only be like the scary grandpa that's ruining your Christmas songs. But his appeal, not only the personal truths he conveys in his songs, is his attitude, and that will always appeal to youth. He has an irreverence for things, including his own work. And it's not just Maggie's Farm, but also on Rough and Rowdy Ways, when he told the Grim Reaper, "The size of your cock will get you nowhere." I know a lot of young people who waited with anticipation for that album to drop just to hear that line, because it's so weird and funny. What is he talking about? I love that guy. And in fandom, you can take him seriously, as many older people do, or you can see him as young people do, with a duplicity of love and irreverence. And while we do love to make fun of him, we also recognize parts of him often undiscussed in his legacy. When he went electric, everyone sees it as this huge, like, cool thing. He doesn't care what people think. But if you go back and look at the footage, like, the man is crying because people are booing him. Like, he is just a man, and that's not something that's discussed in his legacy. There's also the notes of homoeroticism between himself and George Harrison when he hid away in Woodstock. These new voices are able to read into the art of a man, not just a legacy. And that is what is interesting to me. And a testament to Dylan's legacy that will survive as other classics did across time. And I think Bob knows it. He's 80 and just earned his first ever US #1 on a Billboard chart with a 17-minute song. That man is insane. He can do anything. And he survived this far not just through nostalgia, but through a new discovery in these younger fans. In Rough and Rowdy Ways, he speaks of ways to outlive death by Frankensteining himself, by fighting the Grim Reaper, or by going to Key West. But I don't think he has to worry about that. So why am I here? I'm here to let you know that those of us that know Bob Dylan and are young know how good Bob Dylan is. And I think we might more than you know. So I promise you don't have to explain it to me on Twitter.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Next, we have up Anne-Margaret Daniel, who was born and raised in Virginia. She teaches literature at the New School University in New York City and at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson. Her articles, essays, notes, and reviews cover topics from Oscar Wilde's Trials to Bob Dylan and contemporary music. They've appeared for the past 20 years in books, critical editions, magazines, and journals, from the New York Times to Hot Press to the Times Literary Supplement. Her edition of Olivia Shakespeare's forgotten fin de siècle novella Beauty's Hour was published by Valancourt in 2015, and her edition of the last complete short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, I'd Die for You and Other Lost Stories, was published by Scribner, Simon & Schuster in 2017. She's currently editing the letters of Zelda Sayre Fitzgerald and working on a novel. Anne-Margaret lives in Manhattan and in upstate New York, and we are so glad that she made it after many, many flights yesterday to us here in Miami. Welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that generous introduction. Thanks so much to FIU, to the Frost Museum, to the Wilsonian, to everyone here for making us so welcome and for making this event possible. Thanks to the founder of the feast, Mr. Dillon, for bringing us all together here today. And thanks to you all for joining us on a spectacular Saturday when being outside next to those gorgeous gates in front of the building is a serious alternative. I'm here to talk about some of Dillon's most recent shows. I was lucky enough to have heard 3 of them in the past weeks. I heard the shows in Savannah, in North Charleston, and in Columbia, South Carolina. Maybe some of you guys got to the shows. Any hands up for people who were able to go? Oh yeah, which one did you hear? Savannah and North Charleston, wonderful. Rebecca, you heard a couple? New York, okay. DC? Knoxville. Austin. Okay, so some from last fall and then some from this current leg of the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour, which is aptly named. It is the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour. He is currently performing every single song on the record except for the one Rebecca mentioned, the 17-minute one, Murder Most Foul, which centers in and around and upon John F. Kennedy's assassination, his murder in November 1963. Crossing the Rubicon is the new one that he's added in since last autumn's shows on the East Coast, sort of in upper Northeast. The Savannah show was at the Johnny Mercer Theater, which is a beautiful space dedicated to Savannah's lyric native son, with big pictures of him, posters of him around the wall. The acoustics are spectacular. I have to say, the theaters that have been selected for the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour are all really special places, whether they're new theaters or really old historic ones. They're smaller venues. You're really up close and personal if you want to be. And you have great sound. A criticism in past Dylan shows and past Dylan concert tours has been the sound. The bass is too loud. That was a common complaint in the late 90s, early 2000s. You can't hear Bob singing. You can't hear the words. You can't make them out. That is all sorted. The sound is spectacular. You can hear every word he's saying, every word he's sort of speaking, almost like Rex Harrison these days, but he's enunciating. He wants you to know exactly what he's saying. And he seems to be having fun up there, flexing and shifting the lyrics, which is something he's always done. This is not new. This is not something new he did for Mondo Scripto or anything like that. Go on Expecting Rain and just take a search and you can see every iteration. Go to Deliricus, who's the king, and he's nailing every single lyrical variation that Dylan's doing. In the 3 shows that I heard, he shifted them around, he mixed them up. When I Paint My Masterpiece is a really special song on this current tour, as it's been, arguably for decades. And it's particularly germane that so many of us are speaking about it today in a building and at the close of a show that has centered on Dylan's visual, his plastic arts. But in Savannah, he sang Streets of Rome are filled with rubble. You know, everybody cheered. They knew the song. Yeah, old and new. It was one of the old hits. And then he sang something about you got to get yourself into trouble. That was what he chose to rhyme. So he dropped in the idea every night. In the shows that I heard, he changed it slightly, but it was the idea of getting yourself into trouble or being in trouble or trying to stay out of trouble one night. He was shifting around with that idea at the beginning of When I Paint My Masterpiece. Anyway, the first show was at the Mercer Theater, which is pretty much on the campus of SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design. And it's a really beautiful small venue. It was nowhere near sold out. The whole evening had a really casual vibe to it. The venue backs up on not one but two beautiful old squares in Savannah. Without exception, you had plenty of time to go explore the historic towns in which these concerts were taking place, if you wanted to, before the shows. And I did. I walked around the squares and, looked at the Spanish moss dripping from the live oak trees. And you had a really good vibe going into the theater from the places where the shows are being held. For less than $100 on this tour, you can sit right up front. And one night I was in the second row, one night I was in the third, one night I was in the second again. You're, as close to Dylan, kind of crouching behind his piano. He's definitely using his upright piano as a wall between you and him. But he comes out from behind it very often, depending, I dare speculate on how he's feeling that evening. He was most approachable, if you will, the third night that I heard him, which was at the Township Theater in Columbia, South Carolina. But in Savannah, it was still kind of like having Bob and the band in your living room. It's a really wonderful feeling on this tour. And it's also a great band. The core trio of Dylan, Tony Garnier, and Donnie Herron, they've been playing together since the mid-2000s now. And they really have, a fantasy would be to hear them as a trio in some smoky little bar somewhere, kind of like the Shadow Kingdom performance. They would do really well. Bob Britt, one of the new guitar players, is a real virtuoso, and he and Doug Lancio kind of trade off. To me, Lancio gives everything extra that's needed. He fills in on a song. He's very spontaneous, and he and Britt are also constantly watching Bob for direction because he changes things as the sets go along. And this particular band is fantastic at following his sometimes famously difficult to follow, mixing up when he's in the middle of a live performance. But Lancio is a real switch hitter. And he's playing beautifully with the band. Charlie Drayton, the new drummer, should play with Dylan always. He is superb. He really gets it. He gets the music, the timing. He's never too loud on the drums. He doesn't have that even on the rock and roll numbers, even on, Gotta Serve Somebody, and Goodbye Jimmy Reed. He doesn't overwhelm his master's voice. Remember the RCA Victor dog? They're all listening to Bob's voice that way, and they're very careful, all the instrumentalists, not to overwhelm so that his words can be heard, because it obviously matters a lot. The best of that first night, I have to say, hearing Crossing the Rubicon for the first time was a personal highlight for me. It's my second favorite song on Rough and Rowdy Ways after Key West, Philosopher Pirate, which is my pick if I had to pick one. And Goodbye Jimmy Reed is the one that always gets me up out of my seat, even in venues where I'm not supposed to dance. That's probably because I'm a Virginian and I love that last Can't You Hear Me Calling Way Down in Virginia, which is a mashup kind of Bill Monroe and Jimmy Reed himself. But Rubicon was grand, as was my own version of You, which is, he really relishes singing this one. He gets into it viscerally, which I guess you have to if you listen to the lyrics of that song. Like Charles Dickens's character Joe in the Pickwick Papers says, "I wants to make your flesh creep." That's how Dylan performs this song, and you get that sense on the album. But when you're watching him, sort of looking at you over the piano, and you're in the second row, you kind of want to back up a little bit. It's like you feel like he's very good on this tour about looking out into the audience. I don't know if he's making eye contact, but he does like looking out into the audience, and you kind of feel like he's kind of cruising you for those, kind of checking you out for those body parts in this as Rebecca said, this Frankensteinian kind of song. He does a really snaky false prophet. False prophet was spectacular in Savannah, really, really good. And Mother of Muses had a particular oomph to it at the theater in Savannah. He was, I won't say edgy, but he definitely has a kind of a sassy performance aspect overall in this tour. There's a challenging quality. Like, okay, this is the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour. This is my latest album. Like any other artist, when I've got a brand new album, I'm going to debut the songs live. You want to hear Like a Rolling Stone? Come back another day. He generously does do a good number of older songs on this tour, but he's mixed them up. He's made new arrangements. He's changed the words. And this is the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour. If you want to go and complain about not getting to hear Blowin' in the Wind, maybe you shouldn't have bought a ticket. It feels that way because they're enjoying playing these songs so much, and they want you to enjoy them too. And I have to say, in every venue I went to, the crowds did. They knew what they were in for. The Rough and Rowdy Ways shirts were flying out of the merch shelves. I mean, the Rolling Thunder ones were selling well too, but people were there to hear the new songs, and they were really enjoying them. And to say that's rare for an 80-year-old artist, it's rarer than rare, and it's really glorious too. Back to the Mother of Muses, he really puts a bite into that near the end. One of the later stanzas, Mother of Muses, unleash your wrath. It's kind of a cozy, let me rest in your loving arms, this gentle feeling, but it's not entirely a gentle song. It has some bite and some serious power to it that comes out in live performance in a way that it doesn't really, I think, on the album. At first, I didn't like the new arrangement of Key West. It's changed significantly since last fall, but I kind of grew into it over the 3 nights that I heard the show, simply because you could hear the words a lot better, and Drayton's drumming on it, Drayton's sort of the gentle touches that he added, because there's not a lot going on in that song apart from Dylan's lyric and Donnie Heron accompanying. I mean, the other instruments are playing, but they're very subdued. And it grew on me, and I got to liking it. I'd already mentioned the alternate lyrics that he's been dropping, particularly the old songs, Gotta Serve Somebody, I'll Be Your Baby, Masterpiece, and To Be Alone With You. That's completely different. You got something to shake you up on that one when you go to hear it. In Charleston, which was the following night, right after, and they blew out of the venue very quickly after Every Grain of Sand. I headed back to my car, clapped at the end, went straight to my car to beat the traffic out, and I actually saw Dylan and Charlie Drayton and Bob Britt getting onto the bus to leave. Walking out, passed by them maybe 10, 15 feet away. And their bus, you could see the taillights heading up onto the 95 as I was headed back to Beaufort, South Carolina. So they do tend to leave. They leave straight from the venue and go to the next city every night. They don't spend the night in the place where they've just played. That's it. They're gone. Off to another joint, right? Still on the road again. North Charleston was pretty much a brand new venue compared to some on this tour. it's appended to a very large sort of coliseum, and I think the Stingrays had been playing there that afternoon. And as I came in, the traffic coming out was horrendous. There was sort of a little trickle trying to get to the auditorium where Dylan was playing, and all these cars were coming out. But again, the acoustics were spectacular, really great acoustics in this hall. Superb False Prophet and Black Rider in Charleston. Black Rider was a real standout for me. And he did get kind of a yell and kind of a woo on the size of your cock will get you nowhere from the audience that night. And I have to say, Dylan doesn't deploy profanity or obscene words in his songs often at all. He never has. And he reserves that kind of language for people who are real betrayers, for chiefly, I think, politicians or political figures who have committed ultimate betrayals on a population. It's like another politician pumping out the piss. And in this sense, the Black Rider, the figure of the Black Rider, seems to me very much a political figure, a ruler who has somehow gone wrong. Go rewatch Masked and Anonymous. There's a lot more going on in there than you'd think. But that got a yowl, as interestingly did a line in Mother of Muses, which also was commented on by the audience in Columbia. And that line was the line sort of enumerating heroes, military heroes, where Patton is the central figure, but it begins with Sherman, namely William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the Union general who, took Atlanta, and then Sherman's march went from Atlanta to the sea, basically burning everything in its path, crops, houses, civilians' homes. And there was an interesting reaction. There were a few hisses in the crowd, and there was a boo in Charleston, and then more so in Columbia when Sherman's name was mentioned. And that stood out to me, particularly in Columbia, which was not technically in the path of Sherman's march, but which was largely burned by federal troops in those days of the Civil War. And Dylan's a scholar of the Civil War. He's a Civil War historian buff. So that caught my ear, and I wondered if up on stage he was able to hear it as well. But that's something that I noticed and wanted to share with you guys. He did come out from behind the piano a lot more in North Charleston. Crossing the Rubicon was so good that at the end, he recognized it. People stood up and cheered. They were glad to be hearing it for the first time, but it was also a grand performance of the song. He came out from behind the piano. He stood by his microphone stand for a while, and he communed with us a little bit before he went back to keep playing. And, he has a big box and sometimes 2 bottles of water on top of the piano, water that he doesn't drink, but he uses it as kind of a further screen. There are signs everywhere asking people not to take pictures with their crummy cell phones, or at least turn off your flash if you do it, but nobody can seem to stop doing it. And I think that's part of a buffer between him and the audience again. Now, the show at the Township in Columbia, South Carolina was the best of the 3 that I heard. Dylan and the band were coming off a couple of days. They were coming off a day's rest. I've seen him do many hundreds of shows, and this was really one of the best that I've ever heard. He did 2 minutes of a really stellar harmonica solo on "I'll Be Your Baby Tonight," which he hadn't done the other nights. He'd done kind of a little, almost a muffed intro in Charleston and then just kind of put the harmonica down. But this was spot on. All the Rough and Rowdy Ways songs were great. He and the band had just really upped their game with the day off. I don't know, maybe they were just outdoors in 75-degree air with azalea and camellia blooming everywhere in Columbia, eating shrimp and grits. I mean, whatever they did, it worked. And I think the venue also made a huge impact on him. The township was built in 1930, and everybody's played there. You go in and look at the posters on the wall, the Ink Spots, Duke Ellington, Patsy Cline, Elvis. You know, it's sort of a checklist of, if you listen to Theme Time Radio Hour, some of the people Dylan most liked playing on his radio show all played at the township. And I think that's got to be special for the band. Some people may have seen that the Buddy Holly Theater in Lubbock shared a note that Dylan wrote after he performed at the theater, just saying, "Yes, one of the best." And we all know, if we've read Chronicles or any of his early comments about having heard Buddy Holly shortly before Holly's death in the plane crash. He heard him up in Duluth at the old armory. We know what Buddy Holly means to him. So I think actually playing at the township was cool for Bob and the band. I mean, it showed in their performances, which were great. And in his band intros, he was downright loquacious that night. Very chatty, very genial. He thanked the audience. He tried to get Bob Britt to say hello to the nice people. And when Britt didn't, he laughed and he said, well, he's kind of quiet. He had Charlie Drayton stand up. He said, "Stand up, Charlie, so they can see ya." Charlie did. And then he referred to Donnie Heron as an infant prodigy. And then he just started laughing. It sounds like a small thing, but it's great to see Dylan laughing on stage. Rebecca's absolutely right that his sense of humor, which only rarely comes out in some celebrated song lyrics, you know, Freddie or Not, and that kind of thing, his little word plays and puns. He loves that kind of thing. And it's not always nice to see him laughing on stage. Donnie's just 59. So I guess compared to Bob, he is kind of an infant prodigy still. He founded BR 549 when he was 29 or 30. I heard him with BR 549 when they were opening for Bob back in 1997. So his multi-instrumentals that particular night in Columbia showed me just how much they really are the glue binding together a lot of these sets. Hats off to him. Now, where will the tour go next? It ends, or at least this leg of it ends, April 14th, right before Easter, right before Passover, in Oklahoma City. And yeah, I'll speculate. There's still a pandemic on, and it's hard to travel. And especially if you're traveling with a band, with a road crew, caterers, everybody who goes along in all those big equipment buses and the whole caravan of the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour. It's difficult. It's difficult to arrange all that on an airplane to go overseas. They may do it. But I'm thinking that the next leg will probably be the rest of the East Coast, Upper New England, and the Maritimes of Canada. That's been a flight path that Dylan has followed in the past. And I kind of think that's where I'd like to go when it gets hot in the summertime. So perhaps that's where he'll be going. And I really look forward to talking more about performance details, and particularly a few new details that I've found out about when I paint my masterpiece when we sit down and have our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anne-Margaret. And now we welcome our last but not least speaker to the podium, Laura Tenschert, who is the creator of Definitely Dylan, a podcast and radio show that approaches Bob Dylan's work from a fresh, modern feminist perspective. Welcome.
Hello. How does this work? Do I push here for the next slide? Sorry, I'm new to the... Perfect. Great. It's so nice to be here. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to all the speakers thus far. And I'm noticing that basically everyone here has decided to speak about recent Dylan, which I will continue this trend. And I'm wondering if it might also have something to do with the fact that Rebecca mentioned that this is in a sense a historic panel because it features 3 women and 1 man, which is, I mean, basically back in 2019, I went to my first conference on Bob Dylan and I gave a paper about the importance of female voices. But you can just as much say the importance of voices that are not straight white men over a certain age. I just decided to speak about women in that case. And so this to me feels incredibly special to be on a panel that, you know, that's majority female basically. And maybe that's also because it's a historic panel that we've all chosen to focus on the future rather than the past, or the present at least, with Dylan. So thank you so much for the invitation. And since we're here at the site of the Retrospectrum exhibition, I wanted to dedicate my presentation today to putting Bob Dylan's most recent paintings from the so-called Deep Focus series in context, especially in regards to the live streaming event that happened last year, just a few weeks after Bob Dylan's 80th birthday, called Shadow Kingdom, the Early Songs of Bob Dylan. Has anyone here seen Shadow Kingdom? Okay, all right, okay. If not, that's also okay. I'll tell you all about it. So one song that has come up a few times today already, and I will continue with this as well, is When I Paint My Masterpiece. It was already pointed out that it's been a very important song in Dylan's recent set lists. He started playing it again in 2018, then with new lyrics and with renewed fervor, I think we can say. And it's crucially also the only song that survived from his set list before the pandemic, and that he's still playing now, and that he's also played in Shadow Kingdom. So this is the only constant, really. And it is the opening song of Shadow Kingdom. So it has a very prominent position. And I think that this is notable because, I mean, Richard already pointed out that Dylan himself has said that this is a song that has grown on him recently, right? So I think we're not all just basically speculating that this is an important song. He himself has said that this is a crucial song for him. And in order to fully understand the significance of When I Paint My Masterpiece in the context of Shadow Kingdom, and by extension, to understand one of the most important themes running through Dylan's work in 2021, it is important to grasp the role of painting in Bob Dylan's work, in his work in general, and for his songwriting in particular. So this is very fitting because we're here at the site of the exhibition. When I Paint My Masterpiece is a song about seeking inspiration. And it was first recorded in 1971 for Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits Volume 2. And this was at a time when Bob Dylan, by his own admission, was searching for a way back to his creative source. This was after the motorcycle accident. He had kind of retreated from the spotlight. His output had slowed somewhat. He released a few albums that were very different from what he had gotten famous for, gone with kind of the rock star, rock and roll figure, and instead he was kind of the mellow family man. And he seemed to kind of struggle with his identity and with how he wanted to present himself to the world, and maybe also, you know, what he wanted to be writing about. And it's ironic that When I Paint My Masterpiece was kind of the song that he chose to, or this image of painting was what he chose to focus on, to talk about searching for inspiration, because it was only a few years later that it turned out that the process of painting itself gave Dylan what he was looking for. In the spring of 1974, Bob Dylan started taking painting lessons with a man called Norman Rabin, and he is the one who Dylan credits with teaching him how to see. Dylan explains, "He put my mind and my hand and my eye together in a way that allowed me to do consciously what I unconsciously felt." And as a consequence, even when Bob Dylan then switched back to the medium of songwriting, the influence of these lessons was evident in his next album, which I think we can safely say is one of his masterpieces, Blood on the Tracks. Later on, he even referred to the time surrounding Blood on the Tracks as my painting period. And he said that he wanted songs like Tangled Up in Blue and Idiot Wind to be like a painting. The way in which Dylan related songwriting to painting has to do with an idea that he learned from studying with Norman Rabin. And this has to do with how art can capture and therefore shift our perception of time. That, in Dylan's eyes, was the defining characteristic of the songs on Blood on the Tracks. In 1985, Dylan explained, "I wanted to defy time so that the story took place in the present and the past at the same time, yesterday, today, and tomorrow." And a few years after Blood on the Tracks, Dylan dedicated himself to another very ambitious project where all these ideas were incorporated again. And this was an experimental film project called Ronaldo and Clara. Ronaldo and Clara was filmed during the first Rolling Thunder review in 1975, and a lot of the footage you might have seen, even though you probably haven't seen Ronaldo and Clara, which is a 4-hour-long experimental film that, I think is very much worth watching, but for people who aren't hardcore fans, it might pose a bit of a challenge, let's put it like that. But the footage is amazing, and a lot of it has recently been incorporated in Martin Scorsese's Rolling Thunder, a Bob Dylan story. So you kind of get an idea, although, yeah, that's a whole different story. I'm not going to go into that. But with Ronaldo and Clara, clearly the lessons that Dylan learned from studying with Norman Rabin, they had a significant impact on his approach to making this film. And I think that it is because Dylan saw film as an extension of painting. In 1978, Dylan told Philippe Adler, "For me, a film is a painting that comes alive from a wall." So how appropriate then that Ronaldo and Clara too opens with a performance of When I Paint My Masterpiece. One of Dylan's main goals with Ronaldo and Clara was to make sense of the past, present, and future, and to put yesterday, today, and tomorrow all in the same room. And Dylan even boasted to Allen Ginsberg in 1978, "We have literally stopped time in this movie." But how exactly does a work of art defy or stop time? What the songs on Blood on the Tracks and Ronaldo and Clara have in common, I think we can say this, is that they see Dylan move away from chronological storytelling in favor of opening the work up to a variety of disjointed readings. The interest is not in the literal plot, but in the associational texture, colors, images, and sounds. And if you were to watch Ronaldo and Clara, you can really see this in the way, because Dylan edited the film, and there are certain symbols like the red flower that kind of gets passed along. And that kind of takes the place of a plot, Dylan takes these themes and kind of weaves them into one another and uses music to tell the story rather than having a straightforward plot. So that's basically what he's talking about here. And like a painting, a song like Tangled Up in Blue is seeking to occupy several temporal and also spatial planes at once. Let me remind you again of the words Dylan used to describe this kind of process in 1985, right? So this was a few years after Ronaldo and Clara. He told Bill Flanagan, "I wanted to defy time so that the story took place in the present and the past at the same time. When you look at a painting, you can see any part of it or see all of it together. I wanted that song, Tangled Up in Blue, to be like a painting, yesterday, today, and tomorrow." He also said something very similar to Cameron Crowe, and this appeared in the liner notes for Biograph in the same year, 1985. He says, "I was just trying to make it like a painting," again talking about Tangled Up in Blue, "where you can see the different parts, but then also see the whole of it," right? So very similar. Judging by Bob Dylan's recent work, these themes are still very much at the forefront of his mind. And arguably, they have recently found expression with a new intentionality. Not only do the opening lines to the first song on Rough and Rowdy Ways, "I Contain Multitudes," directly echo Dylan's aforementioned interview quotes about defying time. The song begins, "Today and tomorrow and yesterday too, the flowers are dying like all things do." But also, when he spoke to Douglas Brinkley in the only recent interview in 2020, Dylan talked about I Contain Multitudes in a way that very closely resembles his previous comments about Tangled Up in Blue. So here are the previous ones, and he says, the song is like a painting. You can't see it all at once if you're standing too close. The individual pieces are just part of a whole, right? So it's very similar of what he said in the 80s. And painting has clearly been on Dylan's mind since he spent a significant portion of his time off the road during the pandemic in front of a canvas. Both the Halcyon Gallery in London and obviously here the Retrospectrum exhibition have exhibited a significant number of large-scale paintings that are dated 2020 to 2021. This most recent series of paintings is called Deep Focus, and they are these large-scale paintings of mostly film stills. And the series takes its title from a cinematic technique that communicates narrative through the foreground, middle ground, and background, rather than focusing on one visual plane over another. That's a description of Deep Focus from the Halcyon Gallery website. In film, this technique's non-hierarchical approach to the visual planes is said to emphasize continuity in time, space, objects, and action. So basically, I hope you know what that means, right? Because if you have both the foreground, middle ground, and background all in focus, it leaves it up to the viewer to kind of figure out what they're seeing. And it's almost like the viewer themselves are doing the editing by choosing what to focus on. But Dylan's paintings remove this continuity by isolating one frame from its context. And the result is that the image hangs suspended. This is one of the paintings. As a result, the onlooker's focus is allowed to wander and take in the individual pieces of the image as well as the whole picture. So if you look, for example, at this painting called The Novelist, you can look at the man in the foreground with his notebook, but you can almost even read the menu in the background, right? So there's a lot going on. There's a lot for your eye to focus on, depending on, the painting basically doesn't tell you what it wants you to look at. It's up to you to figure out what you want to focus on. In his essay on the Deep Focus paintings, Richard F. Thomas notes that Deep Focus is often interested not so much in the foreground action as in what is going on in the background, off to one side or another. Once more, the literal plot is abandoned in favor of associational texture, opening the image up into several directions, and not just spatially, but temporally as well. In literally hitting the pause button on a certain film still and transporting the image onto the canvas, Bob Dylan is seeking to once again stop time, communicating not just through the foreground, middle, and background, but also through the past, present, and future, which are all implied by the film that surrounds that one particular still frame. In his preoccupation with the relationship between time and image, Bob Dylan's recent series of paintings is also directly linked to Shadow Kingdom. For one, the film shares several visual cues with the paintings in the Deep Focus series, be it the dimly lit club, or the pensive men in hats, the checkerboard floor, which we saw on in the painting The Novelist, or the countless cigarettes. It's like Dylan in Shadow Kingdom inserted himself into a scene that he might have chosen to paint for Deep Focus. And now I'm going to do something that probably will cause a problem. I don't know. I was hoping that the ghost of Shadow Kingdom, which was only available for 1 week online, I was hoping that I could conjure up the ghost by showing you a little clip, but I'm not sure if it's working out, which would be a shame. You know what? If it's not working, let me try something. If you just, Yeah, that's fine. I think that was the next slide. Spoiler alert, you've already seen my upcoming slides. Forget all about it, please. And indeed, every song looks like Bob Dylan is performing within a moment in time that's in a constant loop. I don't know if you caught this in the video, but it's almost like the other figures are not even extras. It's almost like they're part of a tableau that's just moving. It's almost like a GIF or something. For example, there's a clock that appears in several of the songs, but the hands never move. But even more strikingly, if you look at the audience members, yeah, you can see that they are just there to kind of bring a moment to life, right? I'm not sure if you could see this, unfortunately, but in this particular song, there's a man in the background who's moving in slow motion, which I'm really fascinated by, because everyone's kind of moving at like a normal pace, but there's a man in the background who's smoking, and he's smoking in slow motion. And I think that's really cool. So these men in this particular performance, they smoke, they nod, they drink, but they're not really agents that are behaving like a normal audience member move. And yeah, it's almost like they're part of a tableau. And even though the focus in every scene of Shadow Kingdom is firmly on Bob Dylan and his performance, most scenes play with pictorial depth, positioning. For example, here we have the audience in the foreground, Dylan in the middle, and the band in the background, while the lingering camera guides our gaze slowly across the scene. And additionally, the camera largely forgoes any cuts or close-ups in favor of long, slow-moving, or even static shots. In other words, Shadow Kingdom is shot using the deep focus technique. And this is very much deliberate, because Shadow Kingdom wasn't just any old live stream. It was instead a meticulously staged and choreographed film that was directed by award-winning director Alma Har'el, with cinematography by Lowell Crawley. You know, you wouldn't just get a cinematographer and a director for a live stream if you didn't mean to do something quite deliberate with the scene. So this is so interesting to me, because this means that in the 70s, Bob Dylan described film as a painting that comes alive on the wall. And it seems to me like this process of the painting coming alive on the wall is in a sense reversed in deep focus, where a film is reduced to the painting of one frame. And then again, this idea is flipped or reversed yet again in Shadow Kingdom, which is a film portraying a series of moments frozen in time. So we go from painting come to life, to a motion picture brought to a standstill, to animating what could be a painting. It's a bit, I hope you know what I mean. It's a little bit conceptual. And Shadow Kingdom, like a painting that's come alive, also offers several temporal markers, like Dylan was describing in his remarks about the songs that they bring the past, the present, and the future together. And likewise, Shadow Kingdom at first appears to be gesturing towards the past, right? We see the black and white visuals, the audience have these elaborate kind of vintage hairstyles and outfits that look decidedly more film noir than online live stream. On the other hand, and I'm not sure if we see this here, but the vintage aesthetic of the 40s and 50s is juxtaposed with a lot of markers that also ground the film firmly in the present. For example, the band is wearing masks, so which immediately to us suggests pandemic. And there are also a couple of other things that I find very interesting. For example, it almost seems like it's an updated version of the past that where, for example, there are interracial couples dancing. There are people who present decidedly as queer in the audience. So it seems like, I think we definitely shouldn't see this as like a version of the past that's, oh, the good old days or whatever. I think Dylan is like very much mixing the aesthetic of the past with a more updated with updated politics and a more updated version of the present. So Shadow Kingdom presents this kind of anachronistic vision, this moment in time that you can't quite place. And of course, likewise, the familiar songs from earlier in Dylan's career, after all, it's called the early songs of Bob Dylan, right? They all appear in arrangements that are updated to suit the voice of the now 80-year-old artist who's performing them. And this out of time feel is even further heightened by the fact that Dylan and the musicians are not actually performing live. They're not performing this in the moment, captured on camera, but everything is mimed. So all the music was recorded before the fact, and Dylan and the band are coming in and they're just miming this. So again, this is kind of adding to this kind of slight disjointedness that we're experiencing. So where does this leave us, right? Dylan has always been famously unnostalgic. He's never really been interested in going back. And this is, again, something that we see in this kind of anachronistic version of the past. You know, he's interested in the past, but he is not interested in going back to the past. He's not interested in bringing the past back, you know. And on the other hand, his recent projects suggest that he might be also getting a little bit more comfortable with the idea of looking back on his career, right? So, for example, the early songs of Bob Dylan, you know, at first hand, appears to be an almost, you know, a retrospective project. And then, of course, we have the Retrospectrum exhibition, you know, which relates to the Latin word for looking back. So for the artist who famously had a film called Don't Look Back, this is noteworthy. And this reminds me of a quote. 1978 was a great year for Dylan interviews. He said lots of things that I think give us a fascinating insight in Dylan's artistic vision. And he spoke to a journalist called Randy Anderson. And Randy Anderson asked Dylan how he feels about the past. He says, "Do you believe in regrets?" And Bob Dylan says, "No, regrets just keep you chained to the past. You gotta make peace with the past. There's no reason to regret it. You've done it, just make peace with it." And then to which Anderson asked, "Are you at peace with your past?" And Dylan responds, "I am, yeah, I try to be. Yeah, I always try to keep my past and my present and my future all on the same level." So I think you see where I'm going with this, right? And I'm wondering whether this might not also be the reason why When I Paint My Masterpiece has been such a crucial song for Dylan lately. After all, When I Paint My Masterpiece is maybe one of the earlier songs in which Dylan tried to span different temporal planes. If you're familiar with the song, it's about the past being a constant presence, right? On the streets of Rome, the ancient footsteps are haunting the singer, and he's in the Colosseum, and the lions, even though they're separated from him by millennia, seem so vivid that he has to physically dodge them, right? But at the same time, also, When I Paint My Masterpiece is a song about living in anticipation of the future. It's about always living to paint your next masterpiece. And I think in this sense, this song really sums up so many of the themes that we've touched on today. It's about painting. It's about the power of painting to bring all these the past, the present, and the future onto the same level. And maybe that is why it appeals so much to Dylan, because he himself in his career has never been interested in just one plane of time, but has always tried to keep them all on the same level and to incorporate them all into his work. And that is basically where we're leaving where I'm going to leave you with this. I hope that when you go and see the Retrospectrum exhibition, that maybe you keep some of these ideas in mind, and you go on a little journey with Bob Dylan through time, through the past, present, and the future, and see how he puts today, tomorrow, and yesterday too, all on the same level. And I thank you very much for listening.
if anybody, let's first allow the audience to ask questions. Should there be any? Anyone? Please, yeah. We got to do it like this.
I have lots of questions, and I know ideally I should ask something that's more holistic and not just aimed at the last presenter, but I'm going to do that, unfortunately. I enjoyed all the talks, so thank you all so much. And yeah, I have lots I would want to say, but I was wondering, I was actually surprised that you didn't bring in the recent Rolling Thunder review, Bob Dylan's story, because it seems like there he's employing the mockumentary form or medium to avoid this trap of time and be able to explore, this particular time period that you're also interested in without being, held down to the documentary form that he was previously with No Direction Home. So yeah, I just wonder if you think like that could be a further extension of your ideas.
Definitely. I think that's a really interesting question. The reason why I didn't bring it in this case is because, unlike with Ronaldo and Clara, where Dylan really was at the helm in the process of editing and direction and, did some of the writing, Rolling Thunder, a Bob Dylan story, was officially directed by Martin Scorsese. And I mean, I suspect that Dylan definitely was involved in making it a mockumentary and kind of playing with the story and kind of distorting reality in that way. But the reason why I left it out was because I think it's not official what his involvement was. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's definitely a lot to be discussed. But also, I had a certain scope that I had to that my presentation had to fall within. So, but yeah, absolutely.
Other questions? If not, you got it.
It's not really a question, but a comment, because I've given a lot of tours of the exhibition, as you might imagine, and I learned so much today. I wish you had spoken at the very beginning 5 months ago, because there's so incredibly many layers to Dylan's work. I was wondering if you could just comment on something. People talk about Renaissance man, and the true definition of Renaissance man, he seems so skilled at so many different areas of the arts and doesn't have a problem with it. But it seems that people who visit do. And I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit, perhaps, on this sort of, I don't know, this barrier that we have of thinking of how, especially, you were talking about the interweaving of his visual art, his lyrics. If you could just comment on these barriers that I've sort of encountered giving the tours about Bob Dylan as a visual artist.
Can I say one quick thing before passing this on? Because I'm sure someone else can say lots about that too. But one quote that I came across that I thought was really interesting was that Bob Dylan said, "I learned as much from Cezanne as I did from Woody Guthrie." And I think this plays in with what I was talking about. But just in general, I think that Bob Dylan as an artist is so open to art in general, and is not just focused on just music or just film or just painting. And I think it speaks to just generally being an artistic person interested in creativity, interested in in the creative process and in the different ways in which creativity works. And it's interesting that for him too, it finds expression in various media and not just song. But I'm gonna
love to follow on with that. When I first offered a course in Bob Dylan at the New School, I taught it as the arts with an S of Bob Dylan. And I didn't just teach his music and songs, which seems to be what people want the most. That's what he's best known for, after all. But I taught the film, painting, from the very get-go. And I think he has certainly always had that within himself. Recently, I've been lucky enough to read some poems that he wrote when he was 18. 18 or, in 1959 or 1960 when he was a student at the University of Minnesota, very briefly. And in one of them, he's already wondering about the Mona Lisa and why she smiles. And sure, that's coming from Nat King Cole, right? But it's also coming from knowing the painting and having not yet been to Europe to see it, but being familiar with the image and what it means and what it contains. Also, Laura Rightly spoke of Norman Rabin and Dylan's art classes with Norman Rabin, but I would like to give a big nod and a big warm hug, if only I still could, to Susan Rodolo, who was Dylan's first serious girlfriend. They lived together in the village when they were just kids, and she was not only an immensely gifted artist, a painter, a book artist. She made these cut book collages, but she was very involved in the New York art scene generally, including theatrical performances. And she took Dylan to see, Brecht plays she was working on. She took him to museums. She introduced him to Cezanne and to the painters that she loved herself. And that's when Dylan first started drawing and doing his own art. First was when he was living with Susie. So I just like to acknowledge her always.
You mentioned the barriers of, how people can think of Bob Dylan. And as someone who is a big fan of him, you often find yourself on the back foot of having to defend liking Bob Dylan. Even though he is he's Nobel Prize winning, he's a legend. So when it comes to any aspect of loving Bob Dylan, you have to anticipate those kinds of barriers. And you have to just kind of lean into, he's not everyone's cup of tea. You might not think that this part of him is extraordinary. But if you know that he is capable of all that, if he is capable of creating these new classics, these new masterpieces, then that enthusiasm seeps out into other people.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think the barriers are also those imposed by our comprehension of Bob Dylan. So I'm only Bob Dylan when I have to be, says Bob Dylan. And what is that Bob Dylan? So if you were a conservative in 1963 when his songs are being sung on the March on Washington, then you know what Bob Dylan is. He's a protest singer whom you don't like because you're a racist. And he clearly isn't, because that song isn't. Or if you are an atheist in 1979 and he gets born again, you know what you think of the Bob Dylan of 1980 and 81. And so the power of the look of him, the personality, and his art in all forms is such that you need to understand him, but you need to understand that, for better or worse, what you're receiving and comprehending at that moment. And so which is why he's an enigma. None of us know who he is, what he is. We just are acquainted with our own impression. And
can I say quickly one more thing? Because also, I think what I was trying to do in my talk also is to show that these barriers, and this is also what you're saying, these barriers are really not as clearly defined as some people would think, because there are certainly themes that run through all his work across the media, be it the idea of time that we just talked about. Dylan is also very interested in in-between spaces and the going from here to there. And then later we'll be looking at the gates and how much more can you express this idea of an in-between state than with a gate, right? So I think that's also maybe something to keep in mind, that it's not like Dylan is a songwriter and then also a painter and all of this. He is an artist who chooses to express his ideas in various different media, in various different forms. So
thank you so much. We are nearing lunchtime, so I have one question that I'm going to take the liberty of asking. But before I do, let me just remind everyone that after this, we're going to have lunch in the next room. We have Bradley Loretti here who's going to play some music for us, and we have a Dylan Poetry Typewriter Challenge. And please participate, because if nobody participates, it messes up the end of the day. And then, and also after lunch, we have Shai Baitel with us, who is kind of the man behind all of this, to talk with us about that process. So here's my last question. It's actually a question that we discussed on Zoom, so I haven't just made it up out of nowhere. And it's on the one hand, it's a little bit of a hokey one, but I'm curious how you all got into Dylan. Okay, if we can just end on that note, just let us know how, because your talks were so wonderful, and we will all continue to talk with you throughout the day. But if you'll end on that, thank
I
you.
grew up in New Zealand, which is generally 2 years, got things 2 years later than any other place. So in 1964, my school choir sang Blowin' in the Wind because the music director was a very hip guy, and we'd only heard it from Peter, Paul, and Mary at that point. And so that's just my sense of my anti-apartheid work in New Zealand against rugby tours. It resonated with that. I was too young. I was 14 to comprehend Dylan, so I grew into Dylan. I think it's ideal to be 9 years younger than Dylan because you're just catching up with how far ahead of everyone he was at that point. So, yeah, that's it.
I think in a way, a very unusual path into Dylan. I mean, I got into him when I was 16, which is the common age, I suppose. But I think my gateway was very strange because I was aware of Blowing in the Wind, but I grew up in Switzerland, in the Swiss countryside, and Dylan was not on the radio. My parents weren't really listening to Bob Dylan. So it was actually my music teacher who asked me to sing in church because that's kind of where, that's one of the places where you can sing there because there aren't that many venues there. And he suggested I should sing a Bob Dylan song, and he gave me a copy of Dylan's 1981 album Shot of Love, which is the third in Dylan's so-called Christian trilogy. And he suggested I sing a song called Every Grain of Sand, which is now the song with which Dylan closes his concerts, and which makes me very happy because I still have an incredibly deep affection for the song, and I still think it's one of Dylan's greatest, and I still think it's one that is also kind of a defining moment in his career, and it's almost like a mission statement for Dylan, I think. And I heard the song, and I had no idea that a harmonica could sound this tender and this beautiful and this melodic, which even with Dylan it doesn't always, but it certainly does in this song. And I just completely that song just got me, and from that point onwards I had to find out more. And it's maybe not the usual gateway to Dylan, but I think if this song gets you, you're really in, and then you can't get out anymore. And here I am.
Yeah, I kind of talked about it in my speech, but it was just a couple of years ago that I discovered Bob Dylan. I actually saw him live in 2009 when I was 11, and I hated it. It was awful. He was on tour with Willie Nelson and John Cougar Mellencamp, and John Mellencamp was like the most youthful out of them, and I was not into it. But my current fandom came in the pandemic. I was just about to graduate undergrad in 2020, and I was doing Zoom college, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's not fun. And I was assigned again the documentary I'm Not Your Negro about James Baldwin. And I love James Baldwin. He's one of my favorite writers. And in that, they do a little segment about Bob Dylan. And considering everything that was going on in the world, I was very fascinated that there was this guy who performed at the March on Washington, and he was still around in pop culture to talk about the murder of George Floyd. So I just thought, like, what a life this guy must have lived in the public eye. So I watched Don't Look Back, and I was like, this punk, like, this stupid kid has made such a huge career. And as an English major and a classics major, I was obsessed with the lyrics and the music of it. And I was, of course, welcomed in by the community. Shout out to Bob Nation on Twitter. So I just felt like I had a lot to learn from Bob Dylan.
There's a line that I love in To Kill a Mockingbird where Scout Finch is talking about reading, and she says it was something that just comes naturally to her, like being able to sort out tied shoelaces from a snarl. And she can't remember not being able to read. I wish I could remember the first time I heard Bob Dylan, but I can't. My father was an American historian, taught Civil War and Reconstruction, 20th century American history for many decades at the University of Richmond in Virginia. And my mother came from a very musical family in Western North Carolina, a lot of traditional musicians, fiddle players. A cousin of hers was a woman named Lily Mae Ledford, who, if you haven't heard of her, I encourage you to. She had a group called the Coon Creek Girls in the 1930s, and Lily Mae is the real thing. My parents had stacks of Folkways records, including the Newport concerts. I first heard that Dylan, and I subsequently got given, when I was probably too young to be listening to it, but an album by an older cousin called Blood on the Tracks that I puzzled over for hours and days. I first heard Dylan in the summer of 1988. Who knew that was going to be the start of something regular that would continue with me for my life up until the present day and on into the next leg of the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour. I stood in a folding chair about 5 feet away from him in Philadelphia, listening to him sing Trail of the Buffalo, wondering what in the world. And then they performed Maggie's Farm. And he had on his eyeliner and his dangling Shakespearean earring. And I've ridden with him ever since, and I will continue to. Thank you.
Thank you so much.